The moment the word identity clause started circulating inside palace corridors, everything changed. Not slowly, not quietly, but like a sealed door suddenly slamming shut behind a name that once echoed through royal halls. Because this was never just about titles. It was about control, ownership, and something far more unsettling: who gets to define royal identity when blood alone is no longer enough. It began, as these things always do, in whispers. Not public announcements, not official press briefings, but documents. Dry, legal, almost invisible documents that started moving between departments, carrying language so precise it felt almost surgical. Language that insiders say was designed not to explain, but to restrict. And right at the center of those pages, two names kept appearing again and again. Archie, Lilibet, names that once symbolized continuity, suddenly rewritten as legal variables inside a system that no longer recognized them the same way. Because what the palace quietly introduced was something insiders are calling a functional identity clause, a concept so cold, so calculated, it changes the entire meaning of royal existence. The idea was simple on the surface, devastating underneath. Identity is no longer inherited blindly, it must be validated through proximity, duty, allegiance, and absence, distance, silence. All of it counts against you. And that's where the tension snaps into place. Because for years, the assumption was untouchable. Once born into the line, always part of it. But now that assumption is being dismantled piece by piece. The clause doesn't erase names outright. No, it does something more dangerous. It redefines them quietly, officially, permanently. Inside legal circles connected to the crown, the clause is being interpreted as a boundary marker, a line drawn not between family members but between roles. On one side, those who exist within the system, visible, accountable, tied to the structure. On the other, those who exist outside it, regardless of lineage. And suddenly, Archie and Lilibet are being discussed not as future figures of the institution, but as external entities orbiting something they no longer fully belong to. And here's where it gets uncomfortable, because the clause doesn't just question status, it questions recognition itself. Legal advisors working behind closed doors have reportedly begun examining how identity is documented across official registers, diplomatic references, even internal listings that define who is acknowledged in state matters and who is not. This isn't symbolic. This is administrative reality being reshaped. What does that mean in practical terms? It means identity can exist in multiple versions: public identity, private identity, and now institutional identity. And if those versions stop aligning, the consequences aren't loud, they're quiet. Subtle exclusions, missing titles, adjusted references, small changes that don't make headlines immediately, but over time they rewrite perception itself. And that's exactly what caught Harry off guard, because this wasn't a confrontation. There was no warning call, no dramatic meeting, no explosive announcement, just movement, quiet movement. Files being updated, language being refined, legal phrasing tightening around definitions that used to be flexible. By the time the shift became visible, it was already embedded deep inside the system. An insider said the real shock wasn't the existence of the clause, it was the realization of what it allows. Because once identity becomes conditional, everything else follows. Titles become optional. Recognition becomes selective. Even history can be reinterpreted. There are also murmurs about how this clause intersects with commercial boundaries. Because while identity inside the monarchy carries ceremonial weight, outside it carries something else: value, brand value, market value. And suddenly, legal teams are examining whether identity tied to royal lineage can be used, referenced, or implied in any form of external activity. Not banned outright, but controlled, restricted, redirected, which creates a paradox. The same identity that once opened doors globally is now being placed under a form of internal review, not erased, but contained. And that containment is what's triggering deeper concern. Because once lawyers step in, emotion steps out. This is no longer about family disagreements or public narratives. This is structural, legal, calculated. And the language being used inside these documents doesn't talk about relationships, it talks about criteria, eligibility, alignment, compliance, words that belong in contracts, not family trees. And yet, here they are. What makes this even more unsettling is how little is being said publicly. Because in royal strategy, silence isn't absent, it's confirmation that something is being handled at a level too sensitive for open discussion. The louder the speculation becomes outside, the quieter the palace gets inside. And that silence, it's doing all the talking. Because behind it, a new reality is forming. One where identity is no longer a permanent inheritance, but a status that must remain connected, visible, and aligned with with the institution at all times. Drift too far, and the system doesn't chase you. It simply adjusts without you. And now the question no one is asking out loud, but everyone is thinking, if identity can be redefined once, what stops it from being rewritten again? What makes this shift even more chilling is not just what is being written into legal language, but what is quietly being erased from expectation. Because for decades, the public believed royal identity was something solid, something permanent, something protected by blood and history, but now behind those guarded doors, that belief is being carefully dismantled piece by piece, replaced with something far more conditional, far more fragile, and far more controlled than anyone outside the system fully understands. Because once the clause was introduced, it didn't stop at theory, it began to ripple outward, touching areas no one initially connected, small procedural updates, minor adjustments in documentation, subtle shifts in how names are referenced in formal context, and these are not random changes, they follow a pattern, a deliberate narrowing of recognition that doesn't need a headline to take effect. It just needs consistency. And that consistency is exactly what insiders say has been building quietly over months. And this is where things begin to feel almost strategic, because the clause doesn't directly confront, it repositions, it reframes identity in a way that removes the need for dramatic action. There is no public stripping, no dramatic declaration. Instead, there is a slow reclassification, a quiet shift from central to peripheral, from internal to external, from recognized to acknowledged only when necessary. That's the real transformation happening here. And at the center of it is a question that keeps surfacing in legal circles connected to the crown, not spoken loudly but repeated often enough to matter. What defines belonging in a modern monarchy? Is it lineage alone, or is it participation, presence, and alignment with the institution's purpose? Because if the answer leans toward the latter, then the implications are far bigger than anyone is willing to admit publicly, because it doesn't just affect the present, it rewrites the future. There are growing whispers that this clause is not just about current positioning, but about long-term insulation, a way to protect the structure of the monarchy from external influence, from fragmentation, from competing narratives that exist outside its direct control. And when you look at it from that angle, the move begins to feel less reactive and more preemptive, almost like something designed years in advance, waiting for the right moment to be activated. And that moment, according to those watching closely, has already passed. Because once the legal framework is in place, it doesn't need to be announced, it just needs to be applied. And application happens quietly, through systems, through records, through how institutions recognize and interact with individuals connected to the crown. And that's where the shift becomes undeniable. Not through a single dramatic event, but through a series of consistent, almost invisible decisions that all point in the same direction. And here's where the tension becomes impossible to ignore. Because while all of this unfolds behind the scenes, the external narrative remains completely different. Public appearances, interviews, projects, messaging, all continuing as if nothing has changed, but underneath that surface, the foundation is shifting. And that gap between perception and reality is where the real drama exists, because it means one side is operating on visibility while the other is operating on structure, and structure always wins in the long run. What makes it even more complex is how this clause intersects with the idea of legacy, because royal identity has never just been about the present, it has always been about continuity, about passing something forward, about maintaining a thread that connects generations. But when identity becomes conditional, that thread weakens, it stretches, and in some cases it risks breaking entirely, not through force but through disconnection. And that disconnection doesn't need to be declared, it just needs to be maintained. There are also deeper concerns emerging around how this affects future recognition, because if identity within the institution requires alignment, then what happens when that alignment is never established in the first place? What happens when distance becomes the norm rather than the exception? And more importantly, what happens when the system adapts to that distance instead of trying to close it? Because that's exactly what appears to be happening now. Instead of pulling distant members back in, the system is evolving to function without them, tightening its core, reinforcing its inner structure, and allowing the outer layers to exist independently. And while that might sound like a minor adjustment, in reality, it represents one of the most significant shifts in how the monarchy defines itself in the modern era. It becomes less about family and more about function. And once that shift is complete, there is no need for confrontation, no need for public conflict, because the system no longer depends on those outside its core to maintain its identity. And that's what makes this moment so decisive, not because of what has been said, but because of what no longer needs to be said, because silence, once again, is doing the work. Inside that silence, decisions are being reinforced, frameworks are being solidified, and the space between official recognition and public perception continues to widen, creating a situation where two realities exist at the same time, one visible, one structural, and the longer that gap remains, the harder it becomes to bridge. And that's where the real question begins to take shape, not about what has already happened, but about what comes next. Because if this clause continues to guide how identity is defined, then every future interaction, every official reference, every institutional acknowledgement will follow the same logic, and over time, that logic becomes reality, not through announcement, but through repetition. And once reality settles into place, it doesn't need to justify itself.